The male protagonist is the only biological son of a powerful mafia boss. Betrayed by his older half-brother, he is framed for a crime he never committed and spends 6 years behind bars. Upon his release, he returns just in time for the family's grand reunion, the ceremony where the next mafia leader is to be named. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The gates of Fullcrest Correctional Facility groaned open at exactly 6:04 in the morning, and Dante Marchetti walked out into a rain that felt like absolution he hadn't asked for. He didn't look back. 6 years had taught him that looking back only fed the wound. Instead, he lifted his face to the grey Chicago sky and let the cold water run down his jaw, down the collar of the cheap grey jacket the state had given him, and told himself that this breath of free air was the only apology the world owed him. A black Mercedes idled at the curb, engine humming low and patient, like a predator that had learned to wait. Dante recognized the driver immediately. Renzo, his father's oldest and most loyal soldier, a man whose face had aged a decade in the years Dante had been gone. "Don Marchetti," Renzo said, opening the rear door with a small bow of the head, a title Dante hadn't held before prison and wasn't sure he deserved now. "Not yet," Dante said quietly, sliding into the leather seat. "Not until my father says it himself." The car pulled away from the prison walls, and Dante watched the razor wire shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared entirely behind a curtain of rain. 6 years. 6 years for a murder he didn't commit. The assassination of Don Carlo Esposito, a rival boss found dead in an alley behind the Esposito family's own nightclub, with Dante's gun, Dante's fingerprints, Dante's alibi conveniently absent. He remembered the night of his arrest with a clarity that never dulled, no matter how many nights he spent staring at a concrete ceiling trying to make it dull. He remembered his half-brother Vincenzo's face when the police came. Not shocked, not afraid for him, but something colder, something satisfied. "Vincenzo set me up," Dante had told his lawyer, told the judge, told anyone who would listen. No one had listened. The Marchetti family's own attorneys, hired by his father's coffers, had built him the flimsiest defense money could buy, and Dante had understood, sitting in that courtroom, that somebody with resources far greater than a rival family had made sure he went down. "Your father wants you at the estate tonight," Renzo said now, breaking the silence as the skyline of Chicago rose up through the rain-streaked windshield. "The ceremony is in 3 days." Dante's jaw tightened. The ceremony. "Don Marchetti is naming his successor." Renzo's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, gauging Dante's reaction. "All the families will be there. Esposito, Moretti, Falcone, Costa. Every capo in the Tri-State Alliance." "And Vincenzo," Dante said. It wasn't a question. "Your brother has been running the day-to-day operations while you were away," Renzo said carefully. Always careful, always measured. A man who had survived 30 years in this life by never saying more than necessary. "He expects to be named." Dante looked out the window at the city that had once been his, the docks he used to walk with his father as a boy, the restaurants where deals were made over wine older than he was, the nightclub his family owned on the edge of the river district, its neon sign now visible in the distance like a wound that never fully closed. He had been groomed for this world since he could walk. He had been the golden son, the blood heir, the only child his father had made with the woman he'd truly loved before she died giving birth to him. And it had all been taken from him in one night by a brother who wasn't even blood and a stepmother who had raised him with a tenderness he now understood, with the terrible clarity of 6 years' reflection, might have always been a performance. "Does she know I'm out?" Dante asked. He didn't need to specify who. Renzo's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel. "Isabella has been informed, yes." "And what did she say?" "She said she couldn't wait to welcome her son home." Dante almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the wipers lull him into something like calm. A false calm. The kind a soldier learns to manufacture before walking into a room full of enemies wearing the faces of family. 6 years ago, he had been a man in love, a man with a future, a man who believed his family's loyalty was as unbreakable as blood. Prison had stripped every illusion from him except one, a memory he had never let himself release, not once, not even in the darkest months when the walls felt like they might collapse his mind entirely. Her name was Elena. She had been the reason he almost smiled once, in a world that had given him so few reasons. And she had vanished from his life exactly 1 week before his arrest. No calls, no letters, nothing. As if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. He had told himself in the cruelest nights that she had simply moved on, that 6 years was a long time for a woman to wait for a man the world called a murderer. He didn't know, not yet, that she had never stopped waiting. He didn't know that somewhere across the city, in a penthouse belonging to a dead rival boss, a 5-year-old boy with his exact eyes was asleep in a bed shaped like a race car, dreaming small, uncomplicated dreams, utterly unaware that his existence was about to detonate an empire. The car crossed the river, and Dante Marchetti came home to a war he didn't yet know had already begun. 3 days later, the Marchetti estate glittered like something out of a fever dream. Elena Rossi, though the world knew her now as Elena Moretti, widow of the late Don Alessandro Moretti, stood before the full-length mirror in her hotel suite and studied the woman staring back at her with something close to suspicion. Black silk clung to her figure in a way that was elegant rather than provocative, a widow's dress that still managed, infuriatingly, to look like armor. Her dark hair was swept back from her face, and the diamond choker at her throat had been her late husband's wedding gift, and irony she tried not to taste too deeply as she fastened the clasp. "Mama," came a small voice from the doorway, "do I have to wear the tie?" She turned, and her heart did what it always did at the sight of her son, cracked open just slightly, in the good way, the way that reminded her why she had survived everything she'd survived. Matteo stood in the doorway, in a small charcoal suit, his dark curls combed into some semblance of order, his tie hanging loose and crooked around his collar. He was 5 years old, and already too clever for his own good, with a stubborn tilt to his chin that Elena had spent years trying not to think too hard about, because the tilt of that chin was not his father's. It was not Alessandro's at all. Yes, baby, you have to wear the tie, she said, crossing the room and kneeling to fix it. Tonight is very important. Is it a party? Something like that. She smoothed the fabric, avoided his eyes for a beat too long. You have to be very good tonight, okay? Very quiet, very polite. Can you do that for me? I'm always good, Matteo said, with the wounded dignity only a 5-year-old could summon, and Eleanor laughed despite herself, despite the dread pooling cold and heavy in her stomach. She had not wanted to come tonight. When the invitation had arrived, embossed, ivory, the Marchetti crest pressed into the paper like a brand, she had almost thrown it into the fire. But her late husband's seat at the table of the Tri-State Alliance had passed to her, by virtue of a will that named her as steward of the Moretti interests until Matteo came of age, and a widow who failed to attend the naming of a new Don was a widow who invited every wolf in the city to circle closer. She had not known Dante was being released. She found out only 2 days ago from a hushed conversation between her late husband's former capo and his lieutenant, spoken low enough that they thought she couldn't hear from the next room. Dante Marchetti, released, coming home for the ceremony. She had sat very still after hearing it, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could hold her heart in place by force. 6 years she had told herself it didn't matter anymore, that the boy asleep in the next room was simply hers, simply Matteo, a child who belonged only to her and to no ghost of a man rotting, she had believed, unfairly in a cell somewhere. Now that man was free. And tonight, for the first time in 6 years, she would have to stand in the same room as him and pretend, in front of every powerful criminal in the country, that her son's existence was nothing more than a private grief. "You look beautiful, Mama," Matteo said, tugging at her sleeve, oblivious to the storm behind her eyes. "Thank you, my love." She kissed the top of his head. "Let's go. The car is waiting." The drive to the Marchetti estate took 40 minutes through streets slick with the last of the evening rain, past the wrought iron gates where armed men in dark suits checked names against a list with the solemnity of men guarding a cathedral. The estate itself rose out of the darkness like something built to intimidate. White stone, floodlit gardens, a fountain in the shape of a rearing horse throwing spray 20 feet into the air. Helena had been here before, years ago, in another life, in a black dress that hadn't been mourning at all, but something far more dangerous. Hope. She remembered walking these same gravel paths on Dante's arm, remembered the way he used to look at her, like she was the only unclaimed territory left in a world he otherwise owned completely. She pushed the memory down hard, the way she had learned to push down everything that threatened to surface at the wrong moment, and took Matteo's small hand in hers as the car door opened. "Stay close to me tonight," she murmured. "I always do," Matteo said, and together they walked up the marble steps toward the golden light spilling from the estate's open doors, toward a room full of men who would kill each other for power, utterly unaware that the boy holding his mother's hand carried, in the shape of his jaw and the colour of his eyes, the single greatest threat to the Marchetti throne that any of them had ever faced. The ballroom of the Marchetti estate had been transformed into something between a cathedral and a battlefield. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light over 300 guests, capos and consiglieres, senators who owed favours, judges who owed more. wives dripping in inherited jewels and daughters being paraded like currency. A string quartet played something sombre and grand in the corner, and waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most men's monthly salary. Dante stood near the great fireplace at the far end of the room, a glass of untouched scotch in his hand, and felt every eye in the room find him and then quickly, carefully look away. 6 years changes a man's face. Prison had carved the softness out of his features entirely, left behind something leaner, harder, more dangerous. A jaw sharpened by discipline, eyes that had learned to give nothing away. He wore a black suit that fit him like it had been made for the man he'd become rather than the boy he'd been, and he stood with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 6 years learning that movement, in the wrong place, could get you killed. "They're afraid of you," said a voice at his shoulder, and Dante turned to find his father approaching, leaning heavily on a cane he hadn't needed 6 years ago. Don Vittorio Marchetti had aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. His illness, the one no one spoke of directly, the one that had accelerated this entire ceremony, had hollowed his cheeks and yellowed his eyes. But his gaze was as sharp as ever, and when he looked at his son, something in his face softened in a way Dante hadn't seen since he was a boy. "They should be afraid," Dante said quietly. "I spent 6 years in a cage for a crime I didn't commit, Papa. A man who survives that isn't someone you want as an enemy." "No," Vittorio agreed. "You are not." "Then tell me the truth, tonight." Dante's voice dropped lower, urgent despite the composure of his face. "Tell this room who really killed Esposito. Tell them Vincenzo—" "Not yet." Vittorio's hand closed over his son's forearm with surprising strength. "Tonight is not the night for accusations, Dante. Tonight I name my successor. Whatever comes after, that is when we settle accounts." Dante's eyes cut across the room to where his half-brother stood holding court among a cluster of capos, laughing at something, his hand resting with easy possession on the shoulder of a young underboss. Vincenzo Marchetti had grown into his role as heir apparent with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once doubted it was his to inherit. He was handsome in a sharper, colder way than Dante, all angles and calculation, and when his eyes finally found his half-brother across the room, something flickered behind them that might have been triumph, if triumph could look so much like fear. "He knows I know," Dante said. "Then he will be careful," Vittorio said, "and so will you." "This is not the moment, figlio mio. Patience has kept you alive this long. Let it keep you alive a little longer." His father moved off to greet the Falcone contingent, and Dante was left alone with his scotch and his rage, both untouched, both burning. It was then that the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the room's collective attention shifted like a tide. She walked in wearing black silk, a small boy's hand held tight in hers, and Dante Marchetti forgot, for one entire suspended second, how to breathe. Elena. 6 years had changed her, too, sharpened her, given her the particular composure of a woman who has learned to survive rooms exactly like this one. She was more beautiful than his memory had preserved her, which felt in that moment like the cruelest twist of all. He watched her scan the room with practiced ease, watched her nod to the Costa patriarch, watched her navigate the crowd with the fluency of someone born into this world rather than merely married into it. And then her eyes found his. For one heartbeat, the entire ballroom disappeared. The music, the chandeliers, the 300 dangerous strangers, all of it fell away, and there was only Elena's face, pale with a shock she couldn't quite hide, her lips parting slightly around a breath she seemed to have forgotten how to release. Then his gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, to the small boy at her side. Dark curls, a stubborn set to the jaw, and when the boy looked up at his mother and then, curiously, toward the man across the room who was staring at them both like he'd seen a ghost, Dante Marchetti felt the floor of his entire world tilt sideways. The boy had his eyes. Not similar, not coincidentally alike. His eyes. The exact shade of grey-green that Dante had inherited from his own dead mother, a colour rare enough that he had never once seen it on another living face, except in mirrors and in old photographs. "Papa!" Vincenzo's voice rang out suddenly across the ballroom, silencing the string quartet, silencing 300 conversations at once. "I believe it's time." And Elena Moretti's hand tightened around her son's, her eyes still locked with Dante's, across a room now falling into terrible silence, as if she understood, with dawning horror, that the moment she had feared for 5 years had finally, irrevocably, arrived. Don Vittorio Marchetti climbed the small dais at the front of the ballroom with the careful, deliberate movements of a man conserving strength for a performance he intended to finish, whatever it cost him. The room fell into a silence so complete that Dante could hear his own pulse in his ears. Could hear, too, the soft click of Eleanor's heels as she guided Matteo toward a spot near the edge of the crowd, as far from the dais, he noted, as she could manage without drawing attention to the retreat. "Friends," Vittorio began, his voice carrying with an authority that illness hadn't managed to steal. "Allies. Family. 30 years ago, I built something out of nothing. A name that means something in every city on this coast. A legacy I intend to protect for another generation, and another after that." He paused, and his gaze swept the room, lingering, Dante noticed, a half-second longer on his youngest son than anyone else. 6 years ago, I lost something I believed I would never get back. My blood son, framed for a crime, taken from this family by men who wanted to see the Marchetti name weakened. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning toward Dante with fresh, calculating interest. Tonight, that son stands among us again, free, innocent, as I have always believed. Vincenzo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in an otherwise flawless composure. "There are those who expected me to name my successor tonight," Vittorio continued, and Dante felt the entire room lean forward, felt the tension coil tight enough to snap. "I will not." The murmur became something louder. Surprise, confusion, in some corners of the room something that sounded dangerously close to anger. Vincenzo's face went the colour of old paper. "Papa," Vincenzo said, stepping forward, his voice pitched low but carrying. "With respect, we agreed." "We agreed I would consider my successor," Vittorio said, and there was steel underneath the illness in his voice now, the steel that had built an empire. 6 years I believed one son had betrayed this family, and the other had been wrongly punished for it. I will not name an heir until I understand fully which of those beliefs is the truth. His eyes moved to Dante, and something passed between father and son, an unspoken promise, a silent vow that the accounting Dante had demanded earlier that evening was coming, was already in motion. "I have ordered a full investigation into the murder of Don Carlo Esposito," Vittorio said, loud enough now for the whole room to hear clearly. "Every family represented here tonight will cooperate. And when the truth is found, and it will be found, I will name my successor based on merit, on loyalty, and on blood, not on the calendar of a party I threw to please an old man's vanity." The applause that followed was thin, scattered, uncertain, the sound of a room full of powerful people recalculating their allegiances in real time. Dante watched Vincenzo's face carefully throughout, watched the flicker of fury quickly, expertly smoothed into something like gracious acceptance. A mask so practiced, Dante almost admired it. Almost. He was still watching his brother when a soft voice at his elbow made every hair on his arms rise. "Hello, Dante." He turned, and Eleanor was standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of jasmine that used to cling to her hair, could see the fine lines of tension around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago. Eleanor. Her name came out rougher than he intended. 6 years of longing compressed into 2 syllables. "I heard you were released," she said. Her composure, a fortress he could see the cracks in if he looked closely enough. And he was looking very closely. "I'm glad. I never believed the charges." "Is that why you disappeared the week before my arrest?" The words came out sharper than he meant them to. 6 years of bitterness he hadn't realized was still so close to the surface. "Because you believed in me?" Something crossed her face. Grief, guilt, something more complicated than either. But before she could answer, a small hand tugged at her skirt. "Mama, who's this?" Matteo looked up at Dante with wide, curious eyes. Dante's own eyes, staring back at him from a child's face. And the room seemed to tilt again, gravity itself uncertain. "This is—" Elena's voice caught, just barely, just enough for Dante to hear the panic underneath it. "This is an old friend, baby." Dante crouched, slowly, deliberately, until he was at the boy's eye level, close enough to study every feature with a hunger he couldn't quite disguise as polite interest. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentler than anyone in that ballroom had heard it in 6 years. "Matteo," the boy said, with the easy confidence of a child raised without fear. "Matteo Moretti." Dante's eyes lifted slowly to Elena's, and in them she read everything, the question forming, the arithmetic already assembling itself behind his gaze. 6 years and 5 years, and a face that belonged unmistakably, unbearably, to him. "Matteo," Dante repeated softly, and something in his chest cracked open in a way that felt like both the greatest joy and the most dangerous threat of his entire life. "That's a beautiful name." Across the ballroom, Vincenzo Marchetti watched the small tableau with narrowed eyes, and a slow, calculating smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who has just been handed a weapon he didn't know existed. Elena managed somehow to extract Matteo from the ballroom with a composure that cost her everything she had left. "I want to go home," Matteo said in the car. his small face pressed to the window, watching the estate's lights recede into darkness. That man was staring at me funny. Was he? Elena's voice came out thin, stretched over a chasm of things she couldn't yet say. He had my eyes, Matteo said, with the blunt, devastating clarity only children possess. I saw them in the mirror this morning. Same colour. Elena closed her eyes and said nothing, and the car carried them home through streets slicked black with rain, past a city that had no idea it was about to be set on fire. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the study of the Moretti penthouse, her penthouse now, a title she'd inherited along with a dead husband's debts and a dead husband's enemies, and stared at a framed photograph on the desk. Alice, more than anything, an heir bearing his name to secure his family's line, and he had not particularly cared whose blood ran underneath it. He had died 18 months ago of a heart attack that some in the underworld still whispered had been assisted, and Elena had been left a young widow with a fortune, a title, and a secret that she had believed, in her most desperate hours, might stay buried forever. Now Dante was free, and he had looked at her son's face tonight the way a man looks at the answer to a question he's been asking for 6 years. Her phone buzzed on the desk, a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Alone. She didn't need to ask who it was from. Across the city, in the private study of his father's estate, Dante stood at the window and stared out at the same rain-slicked skyline, his mind running the same arithmetic Elena's had run all night. 6 years. Matteo was 5. The math worked if you counted backward from the boy's birthday to the last night Dante had spent in Elena's bed, in the small apartment she'd kept before their world collapsed. The night before her disappearance, the night before his arrest, a night burned so deeply into his memory that he could still recall the exact way the streetlight had fallen across her bare shoulder. He had a son. The thought detonated something in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Not quite joy, not quite rage, something closer to a grief so large it had nowhere left to go except forward, into fury. Someone had known. Someone had orchestrated his arrest, his framing, 6 years stolen from his life, and in doing so had stolen 5 years of his son's life as well. He thought of every first step he had missed, every word, every birthday, every night the boy had gone to sleep believing his father was a dead rival mafia boss, instead of a man rotting in a cell 40 minutes away. A knock at the door interrupted the spiral of his rage. "Come in." Isabella Marchetti entered the study with the soft, gliding grace that had defined her for as long as Dante had known her. The woman his father had married 2 years after Dante's mother died in childbirth. The woman who had raised him alongside Vincenzo with what Dante had always believed, until 6 years in a cell taught him to question everything, was genuine maternal love. "My darling boy," she said, crossing the room to press a cool hand against his cheek, "I still can't believe you're home." "Neither can I," Dante said, and let himself, for one weak moment, lean into the familiar gesture, the way he had as a boy who'd lost his real mother and found, in this woman, something that felt like a replacement. "You looked upset tonight," Isabella said, her dark eyes searching his face with what looked to any casual observer like maternal concern. "The Moretti widow and her son." Dante's spine went rigid. You noticed. I notice everything that concerns my son's happiness, Isabella said smoothly, and something in the phrasing, the careful precision of it, sent a small, cold whisper of suspicion through Dante's chest, gone almost as quickly as it had come. Is there something I should know, Dante? He studied her face for a long moment, the face that had comforted him after nightmares, that had sat beside his hospital bed after a childhood bout of pneumonia, that had wept, or seemed to weep, at his sentencing. No, he said finally. Nothing you need to know, yet. Isabella smiled, and if there was anything sharp underneath the warmth of it, Dante, exhausted, grieving, blinded by 6 years of trusting the wrong instincts, did not see it. Get some rest, my darling, she said, kissing his forehead the way she had 1,000 times before. Tomorrow brings its own battles. She was almost at the door when Dante spoke again, quietly, almost to himself. Mama, he said, the old name, the childhood name. Do you know who really killed Esposito? Isabella's hand stilled on the doorframe for the briefest fraction of a second, so brief that a man less trained in reading danger might have missed it entirely. No, my darling, she said without turning around, but I promise you, whoever it was, they will pay. She left, and Dante stood alone in the dark study for a long time afterward, staring at the door, a splinter of unease lodged somewhere he couldn't quite reach, unaware that he had just spoken to the architect of his own 6-year ruin. They met the next afternoon at a small cafe on the edge of the river district, neutral ground, a place with no allegiance to either family, chosen by Elena specifically because it was public enough to keep whatever conversation happened from becoming something neither of them could control. Dante arrived first, which surprised her. He sat at a corner table with his back to the wall, a habit she remembered from before, a soldier's instinct for always seeing the door. 6 years had changed the shape of him, but not that particular wariness, and something in her chest ached at the recognition of it. You came, he said, as she slid into the seat across from him. You said we needed to talk. We do. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made her, perversely, unable to. Is he mine, Eleanor? There it was. The question she had rehearsed 100 answers to in the sleepless hours before dawn, and now, faced with it directly, all of them evaporated. Dante, don't. His voice was low, dangerous in a way it had never been before prison, and Elena felt the full weight of the 6 years that had reshaped him, the softness gone, replaced by something harder, colder, a man who had learned that mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford to extend, even to himself. Don't give me a politician's answer. I've spent 6 years in a cell wondering why you vanished. I deserve the truth, whatever it costs either of us. Elena closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet. Yes, she said, he's yours. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, stretched taut across the small table, across 6 years of stolen time. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after your arrest, she said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken, quiet enough that only he could hear. I tried to see you. Your family's lawyers blocked every visit. Your father's men turned me away from the courthouse, and then... She stopped, steadied herself. Then someone made it very clear to me that if I tried again, If I so much as breathed your name publicly, something would happen to me, to the baby." Dante's hands, resting on the table, curled slowly into fists. "Who?" "I don't know." A voice on the phone. No name, no face, just a warning, delivered so precisely I understood it wasn't a bluff. Her voice cracked. "I was terrified, Dante. Alone, pregnant, and the father of my child locked away for a murder everyone said he'd committed. Alessandro Moretti offered me a way out. Marriage, protection, a name for my son that wasn't a target. I took it. You could have told me. Eventually, 6 years, Elena. And say what?" Her voice rose, sharp with old grief. "That I married your family's rival while carrying your child? That I let another man raise your son? I was protecting him, Dante. I was protecting both of you the only way I knew how." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes on the window where rain had begun to fall again, soft and grey against the glass. "He has my eyes," he said finally, softly. "The moment I saw him, I knew." "Everyone will know, eventually," Elena said. "It's why I've been so afraid since the moment I heard you were being released. A boy who looks exactly like the Marchetti heir, born 9 months after a scandal that shook 2 rival families. Dante, do you understand what that means? What he becomes, the moment the wrong person puts the pieces together." "He becomes a weapon," Dante said grimly, "in the fight for my father's throne." "He becomes a target," Elena corrected, her voice fierce now, maternal fear burning through the careful composure she'd worn like armour for 5 years. "For anyone who wants to destroy the Marchetti line, or claim it. For your brother. For anyone who profits from chaos in the succession." Dante reached across the table, slowly, and covered her hand with his. The first time he had touched her in 6 years, and the contact seemed to detonate something in both of them, old wounds and old want tangled together in a single point of skin against skin. "No one touches him," Dante said, his voice low and absolute, a vow spoken with the same finality he'd once used to promise her a future they'd both believed in, before the world tore it away. "No one touches either of you. I will burn this entire family to the ground before I let anyone hurt my son." Elena looked at him, really looked, for the first time in 6 years, and saw, underneath the hardness prison had carved into him, the same man who had once promised to build a life with her, a man whose love, however dangerous the world it existed in, had never once wavered. "I never stopped loving you," she said, so quietly it was almost lost beneath the sound of rain against the cafe window. "Even when I hated myself for it, even when I told myself I'd moved on." Dante's hand tightened over hers. "Then let's find whoever did this to us," he said, "and make them pay for every single day they stole." Outside the cafe window, unseen by either of them, a man in a dark coat photographed their joined hands through a long lens and sent the image within the hour to a phone belonging to Isabella Marchetti. Isabella Marchetti studied the photograph on her phone with the calm, clinical interest of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Dante and the widow, hands joined across a cafe table. The boy, she had already had him photographed twice since the ceremony, already compared the images against old pictures of Dante at that same age, already known, before anyone else in this war had even begun to suspect, exactly whose child slept in the Moretti penthouse. She had known, in fact, since before the boy was born. It had been simple enough to arrange 6 years ago. A frightened, pregnant young woman with no family of her own to protect her was the easiest kind of person to manipulate. A phone call in a disguised voice, a threat delivered with just enough specificity to terrify without revealing its source. And Elena Rossi had fled from Dante's life exactly as planned, taking with her the one piece of leverage Isabella hadn't anticipated needing until years later. She had not known back then that the child would someday become the single most dangerous variable in her carefully constructed plan. She had assumed the boy would simply vanish into another family's lineage, a loose thread easily ignored. She had not anticipated Alessandro Moretti's convenient death, or the widow's return to the very ceremony where the Marchetti's succession would be decided. Isabella set the phone down on her vanity and studied her own reflection for a long moment. The face that had smiled at Dante's christening, that had wept at his sentencing, that had welcomed him home 3 days ago with a warmth so convincing that even she, in her most honest moments, sometimes forgot it was performance. She had married Vittorio Marchetti 26 years ago for exactly one reason: to secure a throne for her own son, born from a first marriage to a man Vittorio had personally ordered killed for skimming from the family's shipping operation. She had been 24 years old, widowed and utterly without power, and she had understood, watching Vittorio Marchetti's ruthlessness up close, that the only way to survive in this world was to become more ruthless than the men who ruled it. She had loved Vittoria, in whatever way she was capable of loving anyone, genuinely, for a time. But she had never once forgotten that Vincenzo, her blood son, stood second in line behind a boy born of Vittorio's dead first wife, a woman Isabella had never met, but whose memory haunted every room in this estate like a rebuke. Removing Dante from the line of succession had taken years of patient work. The framing for Esposito's murder had been her masterpiece. A rival boss eliminated, a stepson removed, and Vincenzo's path to the throne cleared in a single, elegant manoeuvre that had cost her nothing but the small mercy of watching a boy she'd raised as her own march off to prison for a crime she alone had orchestrated. She had not expected Vittorio's illness to make him sentimental. She had not expected him to order Dante's case reopened, to delay the succession, to threaten, with his dying breath, to unravel 6 years of careful architecture. And now this child, this impossible, inconvenient child, with Dante's eyes and Dante's jaw, existing as living proof that the Marchetti bloodline ran stronger and more dangerous than Isabella had ever accounted for. A knock at her door. Vincenzo entered without waiting for an answer, his face tight with barely controlled fury. "Mother, we have a problem." "I know," Isabella said calmly. "The boy." Vincenzo's eyes widened slightly. "You knew?" "I have known since before he was born." She turned from the mirror to face her son fully. "Sit down, Vincenzo. It's time we discussed what happens next." Vincenzo sat, his jaw tight, watching his mother with the particular wariness of a man who had spent his entire life understanding, on some level he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely, that his mother's love came with conditions attached to his usefulness. "That boy is a direct threat to everything we've built," Isabella said. "If Vittorio discovers his existence, and he will, it's only a matter of time before someone in that ballroom does the arithmetic. He will name Dante's son as the true heir over both of us. Blood trumps everything in this family, Vincenzo. You know this. So what do? We ensure the boy never becomes a factor. Isabella's voice was smooth, unbothered, a woman discussing a minor business inconvenience rather than the fate of a 5-year-old child. There are many ways to remove a variable from an equation, my darling. Not all of them require violence. Vincenzo studied his mother's face for a long moment, something flickering behind his own eyes that might have been unease, quickly suppressed. And Dante? Dante, Isabella said softly, is still, despite everything, my son. I raised him. I love him in my way. A small, cold smile touched her lips. But love has never once stopped me from doing what's necessary, Vincenzo. You, of all people, should understand that by now. She rose and crossed to the window, looking out over the estate's floodlit gardens, and in the reflection of the glass, Vincenzo could see his mother's face arrange itself into an expression of serene, maternal calm. The same expression she would wear an hour later at dinner, smiling at Dante across the table, asking after his health with tender concern, while behind her eyes calculations turned like the gears of a machine built entirely from patience and betrayal. Find out everything about the Moretti widow's security, Isabella said. Her staff, her routines, her weaknesses. We will need all of it. Very soon. The invitation arrived at the Moretti penthouse 3 days later, an embossed card requesting Elena's presence and Matteo's at a private family dinner at the Marchetti estate, hosted, ostensibly, in the spirit of healing old wounds between allied houses. Elena read it twice, her stomach tight with dread, before calling Dante. "Your father wants us there," she said, without preamble. "Both of us. And Matteo." "I know. He told me this morning." Dante's voice carried a tension she recognized, the particular strain of a man walking carefully across ground he no longer fully trusted. "He wants to meet his grandson, Eleanor. Officially. There's no version of this where we refuse without raising exactly the questions we're trying to avoid." "And your brother? Your stepmother?" A pause. "They'll be there too." Eleanor closed her eyes. "I don't like this." "Neither do I. But I'll be there the entire time. Nothing happens to either of you while I'm in the room." She wanted to believe him. Some fierce, foolish part of her did believe him, had believed him for 6 years, despite every reason not to. But walking into the Marchetti estate with her son felt, in her bones, like walking into the centre of a spider's web, while the spider watched, patient, from somewhere just out of sight. The dinner was, on its surface, exactly as advertised. Long tables draped in white linen, candlelight, an elaborate Italian meal served across 7 courses by silent staff trained never to speak unless spoken to. Vittorio sat at the head of the table, visibly weaker than he'd been at the ceremony, but his eyes were bright and fixed throughout most of the meal on the small boy seated between Elena and Dante. "Tell me, Matteo," Vittorio said during a lull between courses, "do you like horses?" "I love horses," Matteo said, brightening instantly, his shyness forgotten. "Mama says maybe someday I can have a pony." "There are horses in the stable here," Vittorio said, smiling with what looked unmistakably like genuine warmth. "Perhaps after dinner you would let me show you." Elena's eyes flicked to Dante, a silent question, and Dante gave the smallest nod. Whatever Vittorio's motives, the old man's affection for the boy seemed, at least in this moment, entirely uncalculated. It was Vincenzo who ruined the fragile peace of the evening. "He has your colouring, Dante," Vincenzo said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the table, his eyes moving deliberately between Dante's face and Matteo's with theatrical curiosity. "Remarkable, really. One might almost mistake him for your son." The table went silent. Elena's fork stilled against her plate. Across from her, Isabella's expression remained perfectly composed, sympathetic even, as if she found the entire exchange faintly embarrassing on her stepson's behalf. "Vincenzo," Isabella said softly, "that's an unkind thing to imply about our guest's son." But the damage, calculated and deliberate, had already been done. Vittorio's eyes had sharpened, moving slowly from Matteo's face to Dante's. The same arithmetic Dante had run weeks ago, now visibly assembling itself behind the old Don's gaze. "Dante," Vittorio said quietly, setting down his wine-glass, "a word, alone." They retreated to Vittorio's private study, leaving Elena to sit through the remainder of dessert under Isabella's watchful, falsely sympathetic gaze and Vincenzo's smug, satisfied silence. "Is it true?" Vittorio asked the moment the study door closed behind them. Dante considered lying for exactly 1 second before discarding the idea entirely. His father was dying. He deserved, if nothing else, the truth from at least one of his sons. "Yes," Dante said. "Matteo is my son." Vittorio was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion Dante had rarely heard from him. "A grandson. All these years, and I have a grandson I never knew existed. I only found out myself 3 days ago." "And Elena kept this from you? From this family?" "She kept him safe," Dante said sharply. "Someone threatened her, Papa. Threatened the baby if she came anywhere near me or this family. Someone with enough power and enough reach to make that threat credible enough to send a terrified young woman running into another man's marriage." Vittorio's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Dante's hands curled into fists at his sides. "The same person who framed me for Esposito's murder is the person who threatened Elena. I'm certain of it. Someone orchestrated all of it. My arrest, her disappearance, 6 years of my life stolen, 5 years of my son's life stolen alongside it." Vittorio was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in the study's hearth. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man beginning, for the first time, to question the loyalty of those closest to him. "Vincenzo knew about the boy tonight before he spoke," Vittorio said slowly. "I watched his face. He wasn't guessing, Dante. He knew, and he wanted the room to know it too." "You think he's involved?" "I think," Vittorio said carefully, "that it is past time this family learned exactly who has been pulling strings from the shadows for the last 6 years. And I think, my son, that we should not assume the answer stops with your brother." Outside the study door, hidden in the shadow of the hallway, Isabella Marchetti stood motionless, listening to every word, her face For the first time in 26 years of careful performance, betraying nothing at all. Not fear, not guilt, only the cold, patient calculation of a woman recalculating a timeline that had just, dangerously, accelerated. The Marchetti family owned a nightclub on the edge of the river district called Onyx, 3 floors of glass and black marble, a rooftop bar with a view of the entire glittering skyline, and a private back room where deals had been made and broken for 2 decades. Dante went there alone, 3 nights after the dinner, needing the noise and the anonymity of a crowded room to drown out the churn of his own thoughts. He sat at the private corner booth, reserved permanently for family, a bottle of scotch in front of him, and watched the club's patrons move through the coloured light like figures in a dream he no longer fully trusted as real. He didn't expect Elena to walk in, but she did, an hour later, in a deep red dress that stopped his breath entirely, moving through the crowd with the careful confidence of a woman who had learned, over 6 years, to navigate spaces built entirely by men. "I called your driver," she said, sliding into the booth across from him without invitation. "He told me you'd be here. I hope that's all right." "Where's Matteo?" "With my housekeeper. She's watched him 100 times, Dante. He's safe." A small, tired smile touched her lips. "I needed to get out of that penthouse for a few hours. It's starting to feel like a cage." Dante poured her a glass of scotch without asking, an old habit from before, and she accepted it with a small, grateful nod. "Your father knows," she said. "About us, about Matteo, officially now." "He's not angry," Dante said. "If anything, he's furious at whoever forced you to hide it. He wants to meet him again soon, properly." "And Vincenzo?" Dante's jaw tightened. "Watch him carefully, Elena. He's dangerous in ways I'm only beginning to understand." "I already do," she said quietly. "I've watched men like him my entire adult life." They sat in silence for a moment, the club's music thrumming low and rhythmic around them, and Dante found himself studying her face in the shifting coloured light, the elegant line of her jaw, the way she'd learned sometime in the last 6 years to hold herself with a wariness that hadn't been there before, a wariness he hated that the world had taught her, hated more that he hadn't been there to protect her from learning it. "I used to bring you here," he said softly. "Do you remember? Before everything." "I remember." Her eyes met his, dark and unguarded for the first time since he'd been released. "You taught me to dance in that private room upstairs. Terribly, if I'm honest. You had absolutely no rhythm." Dante huffed something close to a laugh, the first genuine laugh he'd allowed himself in 6 years, and it surprised him almost as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I remember thinking," he said, "that I would marry you someday, that we would have this life, this family, all of it, without any of the danger. I was foolish enough to believe I could build something soft in a world built entirely from steel." "You weren't foolish," Elena said. "You were in love. There's a difference." "Is there still?" The question came out rougher than he intended. 6 years of longing compressed into 3 words, and Elena's breath caught audibly. Before she could answer, a shadow fell across their table. "Well, isn't this cosy?" Vincenzo said, sliding uninvited into the booth beside Elena, close enough that Dante's entire body went rigid with a possessiveness that felt, in that moment, almost primal. "The widow and the ex-con, reunited at last. How romantic. Get up." Dante said, his voice flat and cold, in a way that made two nearby patrons instinctively edge away from the booth. "I'm just being friendly to our guest," Vincenzo said, his eyes moving over Elena with a slow, deliberate insolence designed entirely to provoke. "Tell me, Elena, did you enjoy your marriage to Alessandro Moretti? I always wondered what it felt like, sharing a bed with a man old enough to be your father, all while carrying another man's child." Dante was across the table before conscious thought caught up with instinct, his hand closing around Vincenzo's collar with a violence that 6 years of suppressed rage had been waiting to unleash. "Say one more word about her," Dante said. His voice dropped to something low and lethal. "And I will end you right here, brother or not." The club had gone quiet around them, patrons and staff alike sensing the sudden shift in the air, the particular danger of two Marchetti men on the verge of violence in a room full of witnesses. "Dante," Elena said quietly, her hand closing over his forearm. "Not here." He held Vincenzo's collar a moment longer, close enough to see the flicker of genuine fear beneath his brother's smug composure, before releasing him with a shove that sent Vincenzo stumbling back against the booth's leather seat. "You're jealous," Vincenzo said, straightening his jacket with shaking hands, his voice pitched to recover whatever dignity he could salvage. "Jealous that everyone in that ballroom saw what I saw. A bastard child threatening to unravel everything our father built. You should be thanking me, brother. I'm the only one honest enough to say it out loud." "Get out of my sight," Dante said, "before I forget my father's rules about family blood." Vincenzo rose, straightened his cuffs with deliberate slowness, and offered Elena a mocking half-bow before disappearing back into the crowd, leaving behind him an air of danger that lingered long after he'd gone. Elena's hand was still on Dante's arm, and when he turned to look at her, the fury in his eyes had softened into something rawer, something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. "He'll come after Matteo," Dante said quietly, "one way or another. I know it." "Then we protect him," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor Dante could feel in the hand still resting against his arm. "Together, whatever it takes." Dante's hand came up to cover hers, and for a long moment, in the middle of a crowded nightclub with danger radiating from every corner of the family that had raised him, he allowed himself to simply hold on to the one thing in 6 years that had never once stopped feeling like home. Vittorio Marchetti's private investigator delivered his findings on a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the ceremony, and by noon the entire architecture of the Marchetti family's recent history had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to collapse. "The gun used to kill Esposito," the investigator said, laying a folder across Vittorio's desk with the careful precision of a man delivering news he understood could get him killed. "Was registered to Dante, yes. But the ballistics report filed 6 years ago was altered. I found the original lab technician who processed the evidence. He's willing to testify that the report he submitted differed from the one presented at trial." "Altered? By whom?" Vittorio's voice was quiet, dangerous. "The alteration was authorized through a payment traced back through 3 shell accounts," the investigator said. "All 3 accounts were established and funded by the same individual." He paused, visibly bracing himself. "Isabella Marchetti." Vittorio sat in absolute silence for a long moment, his face grey, his hands trembling faintly against the desk's polished surface. "You're certain," he said finally. The paper trail is extensive, Don Marchetti. I would not bring you this information otherwise. Vittorio dismissed the investigator with a curt nod and sat alone in his study for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the folder without opening it again, the weight of 26 years of marriage collapsing slowly around him like a building whose foundation had, all along, been rotted through. He thought of Isabella's tears at Dante's sentencing. He thought of her tenderness toward the boy over 2 decades of raising him alongside her own son. He thought of every moment of apparent devotion and understood now, with the particular clarity that comes only from irrefutable evidence, that he had spent 26 years married to a woman capable of orchestrating the destruction of a child she'd raised as her own, all in service of elevating her biological son to a throne that was never rightfully his. He summoned Dante that evening. "She what?" Dante's voice, when his father finished speaking, came out barely above a whisper, the words too enormous to process at full volume. "The evidence is conclusive," Vittorio said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Your stepmother arranged the falsified ballistics report that convicted you. She paid the technician, laundered the funds through shell accounts, and to my knowledge has done considerably more damage in the years since that we have yet to fully uncover." Dante opened the folder with hands that weren't entirely steady, scanning pages of financial records, witness statements, a photograph of the original, unaltered ballistics report that would have cleared him entirely 6 years ago, had it ever reached the courtroom. "She raised me," Dante said, his voice hollow. "She held me after my nightmares. She sat by my hospital bed when I was 9 and had pneumonia. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, the betrayal too vast to fit into words. "I know," Vittorio said quietly. "I loved her too, Dante. For 26 years, I believed she loved this family as fiercely as I did." "What about Elena?" Dante's head came up sharply. "The threats against her 6 years ago. I don't know yet if Isabella was responsible for that as well," Vittorio said. "But given what we now know, I would consider it a certainty rather than a possibility." Dante closed the folder slowly, his jaw working, the fury building in his chest with a heat that felt, in that moment, like it might consume him entirely. "And Vincenzo? I believe your brother has known, or at least suspected, considerably more than he's let on," Vittorio said. "Whether he actively participated or simply benefited from his mother's actions, I cannot yet say with certainty. But I intend to find out, and soon. What do we do?" Vittorio's eyes, dimmed by illness, but still sharp with the calculation that had built an empire, met his son's directly. "We do nothing rashly," he said. "Isabella is dangerous precisely because she is patient, and patient enemies must be met with equal patience, or they will simply reroute around any obstacle we place in their path. We gather more evidence. We ensure Elena and Matteo are protected beyond any possibility of harm. And when the time comes," his voice hardened into something colder, older, the voice of a man who had ordered deaths before and would not hesitate to order one more, "we ensure that justice, whatever form it takes, is absolute." Dante rose from his chair, the folder clutched in one white-knuckled hand. "I need to see Elena," he said. "Tonight. She needs to know everything." "Be careful, Dante." Vittorio's voice stopped him at the door. Isabella has spent 26 years learning to read every room she enters. If she suspects for even a moment that we know the truth, she will act before we're ready to stop her. And I fear, given what's at stake for her now, that her actions will not be gentle. Dante nodded once, grim, and left the study at a pace just short of running, the folder's contents burning in his mind like an accelerant thrown onto a fire that had been smouldering, unseen, for 6 long years. He did not notice, in his haste, the figure standing in the shadow of the east wing hallway, watching him pass with an expression of calm, terrible understanding. Isabella Marchetti, who had installed a listening device in her husband's study 11 years ago, and who had, therefore, heard every single word of the conversation that had just sealed, in her own mind, the necessity of moving her plans forward with considerably more urgency than she had originally intended. Elena felt it before she understood it, the particular electric wrongness of a home that had been disturbed in her absence. She had taken Matteo to the park that afternoon, a small rebellion against the fear that had kept them both indoors for weeks, and had returned to the penthouse to find her housekeeper, Carmen, standing frozen in the foyer, her face bloodless. "Signora," Carmen said, her voice trembling, "there was a man here. He said he had a delivery, and when I went to sign for it, he—" She stopped, gesturing helplessly toward Matteo's bedroom. Elena's blood ran cold. She scooped Matteo up into her arms, despite his protests that he was too big to be carried, and moved quickly toward the bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. But on Matteo's pillow, arranged with deliberate, chilling precision, lay a single black rose and a folded note. She waited until Matteo was occupied with his toys in the living room, Carmen hovering close by, before she allowed herself to open it with shaking hands. A boy this beautiful should be protected. Keep him quiet, or keep him buried. The choice is yours. No signature. No indication of who had sent it, but the message was unmistakable. And Elena's hands were shaking so badly she had to set the note down on the desk to keep from dropping it entirely. She called Dante immediately. He arrived within 20 minutes, his face carved from stone by the time he crossed the penthouse threshold, and read the note twice before setting it down with a control that Elena could see in the whiteness of his knuckles cost him everything he had. "I'm moving you both to my father's estate tonight," he said. "Full security around the clock. This penthouse isn't safe anymore." "Dante, this isn't a discussion, Eleanor." His voice was hard, absolute, the voice of a man who had already lost too much to negotiate the safety of what remained. "Someone threatened our son's life. I will not gamble with that, not for one more night." She wanted to argue, some proud, independent part of her rebelling against the idea of being managed, moved, protected like a piece on a chessboard. But then she looked at Matteo, oblivious and laughing at something on the television, utterly unaware of the black rose sitting on his mother's desk like a promise of violence, and all her arguments dissolved. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll go." They packed quickly, efficiently, Carmen moving through the penthouse gathering Matteo's essentials, while Dante stood at the window, scanning the street below with the focused intensity of a soldier assessing a battlefield. "Who do you think sent it?" Eleanor asked, coming to stand beside him. Dante's jaw tightened. "My father found evidence today. Conclusive evidence that Isabella orchestrated my framing 6 years ago. falsified ballistics, paid off a lab technician, laundered the money through shell accounts. Eleanor's breath caught. Your stepmother? The woman who raised me, Dante said, his voice thick with a betrayal so profound it had barely finished registering. The woman I called Mama for 26 years. Do you think she's the one who threatened me 6 years ago? I think, Dante said grimly, that we've been fighting the wrong enemy this entire time. Vincenzo is dangerous, yes, ambitious, cruel, willing to hurt anyone in his path. But Isabella, he shook his head slowly, Isabella is the architect. Vincenzo is simply the instrument she's been playing all along. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, a chill settling into her bones that had nothing to do with the penthouse's temperature. What do we do? We survive, Dante said, turning to face her fully, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective intensity that made her chest ache with the memory of exactly why she had loved him so completely 6 years ago, before the world had tried so hard to tear them apart. We survive, and we make sure that when the truth comes out, and it will come out, Elena, I promise you that, she pays for every single thing she's taken from this family. He reached out and cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing gently against her cheekbones, and for a moment the danger circling them both seemed to recede just slightly. Just enough for Elena to remember what it felt like to be looked at like she was something precious, rather than something to be protected out of necessity. I should have found a way to protect you 6 years ago, he said quietly. I should have found a way to keep you both safe. You were in a cell, Dante. There was nothing you could have done. There's something I can do now. His voice hardened with resolve. I can make sure no one ever threatens either of you again. Whatever it takes. He kissed her then, slowly, deliberately. 6 years of longing compressed into a single, unhurried moment. And Elena felt the fear in her chest transform, briefly, into something fiercer, something that felt almost like hope. Behind them, unnoticed, Matteo watched from the doorway of the living room, a small, curious smile spreading across his face at the sight of his mother in the arms of the man with his own eyes. A boy too young to understand the war building around him, but old enough, perhaps, to sense that something important, something that felt like family, was beginning to take shape. The Marchetti estate absorbed them like a fortress closing its gates. Vittorio assigned a full security detail to the East Wing, 6 armed men rotating in careful shifts, and personally oversaw the installation of reinforced locks on every door leading to the guest suite where Elena and Matteo would now stay indefinitely. Dante moved into the adjoining room, close enough that Elena could hear him pacing at night through the shared wall, a sound that felt, strangely, like comfort rather than disturbance. Isabella welcomed them with a warmth so seamless, so utterly convincing, that Elena found herself second-guessing everything Dante had told her, if only for a fleeting, treacherous moment. "You must feel so unsettled, my dear," Isabella said, embracing Elena in the estate's grand foyer with what looked to any observer like genuine maternal concern. "Please, consider this your home for as long as you need it. And Matteo," she crouched to the boy's eye level with practiced tenderness, "I have a whole stable of horses just waiting for a young man like you to explore." "Really?" Matteo's face lit with excitement. "Really," Isabella said, smiling. "I'll have the groundskeeper prepare a pony just for you." Dante watched the exchange from across the foyer with his jaw tight, his eyes tracking every micro-expression on his stepmother's face for the smallest crack in the performance, and finding, infuriatingly, none at all. "She's good," Eleanor murmured to him later, once Matteo had been settled with Carmen for his afternoon nap. "Frighteningly good. If I didn't know—" "I know," Dante said grimly. 26 years of practice. She fooled me my entire life, Elena. She fooled my father. There's no reason to expect she wouldn't fool you too." "We can't let her near him alone," Elena said, her voice tight with fear. "Not for a single moment." "She won't be," Dante said. "I've arranged for Carmen or myself to be with him constantly. My father's men are watching every entrance to the estate. If Isabella moves against him, we'll know within minutes." But knowing within minutes, Elena thought, might not be fast enough if Isabella truly was capable of everything the evidence suggested. That evening, dinner was a tense affair of surface pleasantries, Vittorio presiding at the head of the table with a new watchfulness that betrayed, to anyone paying close attention, exactly how much had shifted in the family's internal calculus over the preceding days. Vincenzo, seated across from Dante, wore his usual mask of easy confidence, though Elena noticed his eyes flicking repeatedly toward his mother, seeking some reassurance she seemed unwilling or unable to fully provide. "You've been quiet tonight, Mother," Vincenzo said during a lull in the meal. "I'm simply enjoying having family under one roof again," Isabella said smoothly, her eyes moving to meet Vittorio's across the table, with a warmth that, for the first time Elena had witnessed, seemed to falter just slightly under the weight of her husband's returning gaze, cold, assessing, no longer entirely convinced. "Vittorio," Isabella said, her voice carrying the faintest edge of concern, "you seem troubled, my love. Is everything all right?" "I am simply tired," Vittorio said, his voice carefully neutral. "The illness takes more from me each day. But I find myself lately thinking a great deal about legacy, about the true nature of those closest to me." Isabella's hand, resting on the table, went very still. "What a strange thing to say," she said lightly, though something in her voice had thinned, sharpened. "Is it?" Vittorio's eyes held hers for a long, charged moment. "I only mean, my dear, that dying men tend to see things more clearly than living ones. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how carefully it's been buried." The table fell into an uncomfortable silence, and Elena watched Isabella's composure hold barely, like a dam straining against a flood it could no longer fully contain. Vincenzo's eyes darted between his parents with poorly concealed alarm, clearly sensing an undercurrent he didn't yet fully understand. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena slipped from her room to check on Matteo, only to find Dante already there, sitting in the armchair beside the boy's bed, watching him sleep with an expression of such raw, undefended tenderness that Elena felt her chest tighten painfully. "You should be resting," she whispered, moving to stand beside him. "I can't," Dante said quietly, not taking his eyes off his son. 5 years, Elena. 5 years I could have had this. Every night he fell asleep. Every morning he woke up. I could have been here. You're here now. It's not enough. His voice cracked, just slightly, the first genuine break in his composure since she'd found him waiting outside the prison gates, in her memory of that first article she'd read weeks ago. I keep thinking about everything I missed. His first steps. His first words. I don't even know what his first word was. It was no, Eleanor said, a small, watery laugh escaping her despite everything. He said it constantly for about a year, drove Alessandro half mad. Dante's mouth curved, just slightly, at the mention of the boy's stubbornness, and Eleanor moved to sit on the arm of his chair, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder. We'll make new memories, she said softly, starting now. Whatever happens with Isabella, whatever war is coming, you're his father, Dante. That's not something 6 years or 6 wars can take away. Dante's hand covered hers, and together they sat in silence, watching their son sleep. Unaware that in the east wing of the estate, Isabella Marchetti was already at that very hour making a phone call that would set the next stage of her plan irrevocably into motion. The attack came 3 days later in the chaos of the estate's weekly market delivery, when a service truck that should have contained produce instead contained 4 armed men who had bribed their way past the outer gate's inattentive junior guard. Elena was in the garden with Matteo when the first gunshot rang out from the direction of the kitchen entrance, and every instinct in her body screamed into motion before conscious thought could catch up. Down! She grabbed Matteo and threw them both behind the stone fountain, her heart hammering, her hands shaking as she pressed her son's face into her shoulder to shield him from whatever was happening. More gunfire, shouting, the distinct heavy sound of Marchetti security responding, exchanging fire with the intruders somewhere near the service entrance. "Mama, I'm scared," Matteo whispered, his small body trembling against hers. "I know, baby, I know. Stay very still, okay? Very quiet." She heard footsteps approaching across the gravel path, heavy, deliberate, not the light, quick steps of estate staff, and her blood turned to ice. She pressed herself and Matteo further into the shadow of the fountain, praying with a desperation she hadn't felt since the terrified early months of her pregnancy that whoever was coming would pass them by. "There," a rough voice said, close enough now that Elena could hear the smile in it, "right where the mother said they'd be." Elena's blood went cold at the phrasing, not a guess, not a search, a certainty. Someone had told these men exactly where to find them. A gunshot rang out from a different direction, closer, and the man's voice cut off abruptly, followed by the heavy sound of a body falling. Elena looked up, shaking, to find Dante standing over the fallen intruder, a gun in his hand, his face a mask of lethal fury. "Elena!" He was at her side in seconds, pulling her and Matteo up from behind the fountain, his hands running over both of them with frantic urgency, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" "We're okay," Elena managed, her voice shaking. "We're okay, Dante." More gunfire echoed from the estate's main building, and Dante's face hardened. "We need to move. Now." He led them at a run toward the estate's reinforced panic room, a space Vittorio had installed decades ago for exactly this kind of contingency. And by the time they reached its heavy steel door, 2 more of Vittorio's security detail had joined them, blood-streaked but alive, forming a protective perimeter as Dante ushered Elena and Matteo inside. "Stay here," Dante ordered. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone except my father or myself. Is that understood? Dante, wait! But he was already gone, back out into the chaos, his gun raised, moving with the lethal efficiency of a man who had spent 6 years in a cage, learning exactly how much rage a human body could store, and exactly how it might be released when finally given the chance. The firefight lasted another 11 minutes. Elena counted every single one of them from inside the panic room, her arms wrapped around Matteo, her whole body trembling with a fear so complete it felt like drowning. When the door finally opened, it was Vittorio's voice that called through it first. "It's over. You're safe." She emerged, shaking, into a scene of controlled chaos. Security personnel moving bodies, a doctor tending to a wounded guard, the estate's grand foyer scarred with bullet holes that would take weeks to properly repair. Dante found her within seconds, pulling her and Matteo into an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked the air from her lungs. "They knew exactly where we'd be," Elena said against his chest, her voice muffled with lingering terror. "One of them said someone told him. The mother told him." Dante went very still. "What?" He said, "Right where the mother said they'd be." Elena pulled back to look at him, understanding dawning slowly, horribly, across both their faces at once. "Dante, they didn't mean me. They meant—" "Isabella," Dante finished, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. They found her 20 minutes later in her private study, composed and pale, insisting with wide-eyed shock that she'd been in her rooms the entire time, that she'd heard the gunfire and locked her door in terror like anyone else would. "How dare you suggest I would ever put that child in danger?" Isabella said, her voice trembling with what looked, convincingly, like wounded indignation. "I love that boy. I love all of you. How could either of you believe I would orchestrate such a thing?" Vittorio stood in the doorway of the study, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed on his wife of 26 years, with an expression Eleanor had never seen on him before. Grief, fury, and the particular cold finality of a man who had, at last, run entirely out of doubt. "Because," Vittorio said quietly, "one of the 4 men who attacked this house was found alive, Isabella, and before he died of his wounds 20 minutes ago, he gave a full confession, naming exactly who hired him." Isabella's composure did not break, not fully, not yet. But something in her eyes shifted, recalculated, a woman realizing in real time that the ground beneath her 26-year performance had finally, irrevocably, given way. "Vittorio," she said softly, "whatever you think you know." "I know everything," Vittorio said, "and soon, my dear, so will everyone else." Isabella Marchetti did not run. Running, she understood with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent decades building an empire of careful appearances, would only confirm every accusation now levelled against her. Instead, she sat very still in her study's antique chair, her hands folded in her lap, and studied her husband's face across the room with something that might have been, for the first time in years, genuine fear. 26 years, Vittorio said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, the terrible gentleness of a man past the point of rage and settled into something colder and more permanent. 26 years, I believed you loved this family as fiercely as I built it. I did love this family, Isabella said, and for once the words carried a raw, unguarded quality that suggested perhaps at least this much was true. I loved you, Vittorio. I loved Dante, in my way, as much as I loved my own son. You framed him for murder. Vittorio's voice hardened. You stole 6 years of his life. You threatened a pregnant young woman until she fled in terror, denying my son his own child for 5 years. You just tried to have that child murdered in my own garden. Do not sit there and tell me about love, Isabella. Everything I did, Isabella said, rising slowly from her chair, her composure finally visibly cracking. I did to secure a future for my son. Do you have any idea what it felt like, Vittoria? Watching Vincenzo grow up second in line, always second, always the lesser heir, simply because he wasn't born from your precious dead first wife. He was never lesser, Vittorio said. He was simply not the blood heir. That is not a crime, Isabella. What you did to correct it, that is a crime beyond any forgiveness I am capable of offering. Dante stood near the study's door, Elena beside him, listening to the unravelling of the woman who had raised him, with an expression carved from equal parts fury and grief, the two emotions so intertwined he could no longer separate where one ended and the other began. "Why the ballistics report?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room for the first time. "Why frame me specifically, Mama? You could have simply had me killed. It would have been cleaner, faster." Isabella turned to face him, and something in her expression softened, briefly, into what looked almost like genuine maternal grief. "Because I could not bring myself to kill you, Dante. Whatever else I have done, whatever else you believe of me now, I never once wanted you dead. Prison seemed at the time like mercy." Mercy. Dante's laugh came out hollow, broken. 6 years in a cage. A childhood I couldn't watch my son live through. You call that mercy? "I call it," Isabella said quietly, "the only kindness I was capable of offering, given what I needed to accomplish." "And Esposito?" Vittorio's voice cut in sharp. "Did you kill him yourself, or simply arrange it?" Isabella's silence answered the question more completely than any words could have. "I hired someone," she said finally. "A professional, untraceable. Esposito was becoming a liability regardless. His family's territorial ambitions threatened our shipping routes for years. Removing him and framing Dante for it accomplished 2 objectives at once. I have always believed in efficiency, Vittorio. You taught me that yourself." The room fell into a silence so absolute that Elena could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, could feel Matteo's small hand gripping hers from where she'd positioned him carefully behind her, out of the direct line of whatever violence might yet erupt in this room. "What happens now?" Isabella asked, and for the first time her voice carried something close to genuine fear. Vittorio was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly around the study. The room where he'd conducted business for 30 years, where he'd made and broken alliances, where he'd once, foolishly, believed himself protected from betrayal by the simple fact of marriage. "This family has rules, Isabella," he said finally. "Rules that exist above sentiment, above even love. You know this. You have exploited these rules for 26 years to build the very trust you then betrayed." "Vittorio." "You will face the council," Vittorio said, his voice absolute, final. "Every capo, every family in this alliance will hear what you've done, and they will decide collectively what justice looks like for a woman who orchestrated the murder of a rival don, the framing of the true heir, and the attempted murder of an innocent child." Isabella's face went the colour of old paper, understanding, finally, the true weight of what she now faced. Not simply her husband's judgment, but the judgment of an entire criminal empire built on codes far older and far less forgiving than any court of law. "Vincenzo," she said suddenly, urgently, "whatever you decide for me, he had no part in this. He didn't know, Vittorio. Please, whatever else you believe of me, believe that my son is innocent in this." But even as she said it, Dante saw the flicker of doubt cross his father's face, and understood, with a cold certainty, that the reckoning in this family was far from finished. Vincenzo Marchetti was summoned to his father's study an hour after Isabella's confession, and the moment he crossed the threshold and saw his mother seated pale and silent in the corner, Vittorio's face carved from granite, Dante's eyes burning with a fury barely contained, he understood, with the particular clarity of a man realizing the ground had shifted permanently beneath him, that everything was about to change. "Sit down," Vittorio said. Vincenzo sat. "Your mother has confessed to orchestrating Esposito's murder, framing Dante for it, threatening Elena Moretti into fleeing this family 6 years ago, and attempting to have your nephew murdered in this very house 3 hours ago." Vittorio's voice was flat, exhausted, the voice of a man who had aged a decade in a single afternoon. "I want to know, right now, exactly how much of this you knew." Vincenzo's eyes moved to his mother, seeking some guidance, some script to follow, and finding only her pale, silent face offering nothing. "I knew about the framing," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the details. I didn't know about the falsified ballistics, not specifically. But I knew, after Dante's arrest, that something wasn't right. I suspected my mother's involvement. I chose not to look too closely because—" He stopped, his composure cracking for the first time Dante had seen in 6 years. "Because it benefited me. Because it cleared my path to the succession." "And the attack today?" Vittorio's voice was ice. "I had no idea," Vincenzo said, and for the first time his voice carried something that sounded like genuine horror. "Mother, tell him. Tell him I had no part in that." "He had no part in it," Isabella said quietly, not looking up from her hands folded in her lap. "I told you that already, Vittorio. Whatever crimes you lay at my feet, do not lay them at his." Dante watched the exchange with a fury that had nowhere left to go. 6 years of betrayal finally finding a target too complicated to simply destroy. "You knew," he said to Vincenzo, his voice low and dangerous. "You knew I didn't kill Esposito. You let me rot in a cell for 6 years, and you said nothing." "I was 26 years old, Dante," Vincenzo said, some of his old defensiveness returning. "I'd spent my entire life in your shadow, watching my mother tell me over and over that I would always be second, that the throne was yours by blood, no matter how hard I worked to earn it. When the opportunity came to change that, you took it," Dante finished coldly. "Whatever the cost to me, to Elena, to a child you didn't even know existed." "I didn't know about the boy," Vincenzo said quietly. "I swear to you, Dante, I never knew Elena was pregnant. If I had—" "You would have done exactly what your mother did," Dante said. "Used him as a weapon, just like you tried to do at the ceremony, at dinner, in front of the entire family. Vincenzo had no answer for that, and the silence that followed confirmed everything Dante needed to know. Vittorio rose slowly from his desk, moving with the careful deliberation of a dying man conserving what strength remained, and stood before his wife and his elder son with an expression of profound, weary grief. "I built this family on the belief that blood and loyalty meant something," he said. "That the people closest to me, whatever their flaws, would never turn that closeness into a weapon against the family itself. I was wrong about both of you, in different ways and to different degrees, and that failure sits with me as heavily as anything either of you has done."
"Papa," Vincenzo started. "I am not finished." Vittorio's voice cut through the room with unexpected steel. "Isabella will face the council, as I have said. Her fate is no longer mine alone to decide. It belongs to every family in this alliance whose trust she violated alongside mine. As for you, Vincenzo," he turned to face his elder son fully, "you will step back from every position of authority in this family, effective immediately. You benefited from a crime you did not commit, but chose not to expose. That is a betrayal in its own right, and it carries its own consequences." "You're disowning me," Vincenzo said, his voice hollow. "I am giving you a chance to earn back what trust you can," Vittorio said, "something your brother was never given the opportunity to do when the false crime was laid at his feet instead.
Consider it more mercy than you extended to him." Vincenzo's face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, anger, and finally something that looked almost like shame, before he rose from his chair and left the study without another word, his mother's eyes following him with an expression of grief so raw it was, for the first time in the entire confrontation, entirely unperformed. "And me?" Isabella asked quietly, once her son had gone. Vittorio looked at his wife for a long, silent moment. The woman he had loved, or believed he had loved, for 26 years, and something in his face, despite everything, cracked with a grief that had nowhere left to go. "You will remain in this house under guard until the council convenes," he said. "And then, Isabella, whatever love I once held for you will have to be enough to let me watch you face what you have earned, without trying to save you from it."
He left the room, and Isabella sat alone in the silence that followed, staring at nothing, understanding at last that 26 years of careful architecture had finally, irrevocably, come crashing down around her. The estate settled into an uneasy quiet in the days that followed, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone dares believe the danger is truly over. Isabella remained confined to her private wing, two of Vittorio's most trusted men stationed outside her door around the clock.
Vincenzo had disappeared from the estate entirely, his whereabouts unknown even to his father, and Elena found herself, for the first time in weeks, able to breathe without the constant grinding fear that had accompanied every moment since Dante's release. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked Dante one evening, the two of them sitting together on the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens, now quiet under a sky heavy with stars. "The council convenes in 3 days," Dante said. "Once they've rendered judgment on Isabella, one chapter of this closes. But Vincenzo is still out there, Elena. Wounded pride and public disgrace make dangerous men more dangerous, not less." "And your father?" Dante's expression softened into something sadder. His illness is progressing faster than the doctors expected. I think—" He paused, his voice thickening slightly. "I think the stress of these last weeks has cost him more than he'll admit." Elena reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching Matteo chase fireflies across the lawn below with Carmen's careful supervision, his laughter carrying up to them on the evening air like the sound of something the entire family desperately needed. "I keep thinking," Dante said quietly, "about everything I want to give him. Everything I missed, everything I can't get back. I want to build something different for him, Elena. Something that isn't just this." He gestured vaguely at the estate, at the empire his family had built from violence and fear. "Something that lets him grow up without needing to learn the things I had to learn." "Is that possible?" Elena asked. "In this world?" "I don't know," Dante admitted, "but I intend to try. Whatever throne my father leaves behind, whatever power comes with it, I want to use it to build something safer for our son than what was built for me." Eleanor studied his profile in the moonlight. The hardness prison had carved into him, softened now by something she recognized as hope, however cautious. "You've changed," she said softly, "since you came home. I don't just mean the way you look, I mean—" She searched for the words. "There's something in you now that wasn't there before. A gentleness underneath all the danger." 6 years alone with nothing but my own thoughts will do that to a man, Dante said. I had a great deal of time to think about what mattered, once everything else had been stripped away. You mattered, Elena. You mattered more than the throne, more than my father's approval, more than anything else this family could offer me. I understood that clearly, somewhere around year 3, staring at a concrete ceiling and realizing that if I never saw you again, nothing else I might gain would ever feel like enough. Elena's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. I thought about you every single day, she said, even after I married Alessandro. Even when I told myself I'd moved on, some part of me was always waiting, Dante, always hoping. He turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheekbone. Marry me, he said quietly. Elena's breath caught. Dante! Not for the family. Not for the throne, not for Matteo's legitimacy, not for any of the reasons a man in my position is supposed to marry. His voice was low, urgent, stripped of every calculation that usually coloured conversations in this world. Marry me because I have loved you since I was 23 years old, and 6 years in a cell only made that love more absolute, not less. Marry me because our son deserves parents who chose each other, not parents who were forced together by circumstance and danger. Elena searched his face for a long moment, the man who had once promised her a future before the world tore it away, the man who had come home harder, darker, but no less devoted to the same fragile dream they'd once shared. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Dante, 1,000 times yes. He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like the resumption of something that had never truly ended, only paused, cruelly, for 6 long years. Below them, in the garden, Matteo looked up from his game of chasing fireflies, caught sight of his parents silhouetted against the moonlit terrace, and smiled. A small, unremarkable moment that neither Dante nor Elena would ever forget. the first evening in 6 years that felt, finally, like the beginning of the life they had both been promised and denied in equal measure. The council convened 3 days later in the great hall of the Falcone estate, chosen as neutral ground by mutual agreement of the 5 families who made up the tri-state alliance: Marchetti, Falcone, Costa, the remaining Esposito faction, now led by Carlo's younger brother, and the Moretti interests, represented, in a twist of fate that felt almost too neat, by Elena herself. Isabella Marchetti stood before the assembled dons in a plain black dress, stripped of the jewels and furs that had defined her public image for decades, her composure held together by what Dante recognized, watching from his seat beside his father, as pure, desperate willpower. "You stand accused," Don Falcone said, presiding over the council with the gravity of a man who understood exactly how much precedent this judgment would set, "of orchestrating the murder of Don Carlo Esposito, framing an innocent heir for that crime, and attempting the murder of a child. How do you answer these charges?" "I do not deny them," Isabella said, her voice steady despite everything. "I did what I believed necessary to secure my son's future in a world that offered him nothing by right of blood alone." A murmur rippled through the assembled families, not sympathy precisely, but a kind of grim understanding from men and women who had all, in their own ways, made ruthless calculations to protect their own bloodlines. "The council does not judge motive," Don Costa said coldly. "We judge action and consequence. You murdered a sitting don of this alliance and framed another family's heir for it. You threatened an innocent woman and denied a child his father for 5 years. You ordered an attack on a private estate that resulted in the deaths of your own husband's security personnel. These are not the actions of a woman protecting her family. These are the actions of a woman who declared war on this entire alliance in service of her own ambition." Isabella's composure finally cracked, just slightly, at the word war, a word that carried, in this world, only one possible resolution. "I ask the council for mercy," she said quietly. "Not for myself, for my son Vincenzo, who played no part in these crimes beyond a young man's failure to look too closely at a gift he should have questioned." "Vincenzo's fate is a separate matter," Don Falcone said, "already decided by Don Marchetti's own judgment. We are here to render judgment on you alone." The council deliberated for nearly an hour, the 5 dons conferring in low voices, while Isabella stood, unmoving, in the centre of the great hall, and Dante watched his father's face throughout, searching for some sign of the grief he knew must be tearing through the old man beneath his carefully composed exterior. When Don Falcone finally rose to deliver the council's judgment, the hall fell into absolute silence. "Isabella Marchetti," he said, "the council finds you guilty of all charges. In accordance with the old laws that have governed this alliance for generations, your life is forfeit to the family you have wronged most directly, the Marchetti line, whose heir you sought to destroy." Every eye in the room turned to Vittorio, and Dante felt his father's hand find his own beneath the table, gripping it with a strength that belied the illness ravaging his body. "Vittorio Marchetti," Don Falcone said, "as the wronged party, the manner of justice is yours to decide." The silence stretched, agonizing, and Dante watched his father rise slowly to his feet, his eyes fixed on the woman who had shared his bed and his life for 26 years, who had raised his son with a devotion that had turned out to be, ultimately, a performance in service of betrayal. "I loved you, Isabella," Vittorio said, his voice carrying through the hall with a quiet, terrible finality. "Whatever else is true, that much was real, at least on my part. But love does not erase what you have done. It does not return the 6 years you stole from my son, or the years he lost with his own child." "Vittorio, I will not have you killed," Vittorio said, and a murmur of surprise moved through the hall. "Death, for you, would be too swift a mercy. Instead, I strip you of the Marchetti name, of every asset, every account, every claim you have to this family's wealth or protection. You will be exiled from this alliance's territory permanently under the watch of this council, and should you ever attempt to return or to make contact with any member of this family without express permission, the sentence of death will be carried out immediately by any hand willing to claim it." Isabella's face, for the first time in the entire proceeding, showed genuine fear. A fate perhaps worse than death for a woman who had spent her entire life building power and position, now facing a future stripped of everything she had sacrificed her soul to acquire. "And Vincenzo?" she asked, her voice small. "Vincenzo made his own choices," Vittorio said. "He will live with the consequences of them, separately from yours, as I have already decided. Take her," he said to the guards flanking the hall's entrance, his voice breaking just slightly on the final word. "Take her far from here, and do not let her return." Isabella was led from the hall in silence, her back straight, even in defeat, and Dante watched her go with an emotion so complicated he couldn't fully name it. Grief for the mother he'd believed he'd had, fury for the woman she'd actually been, and beneath both, a strange, hollow relief that the 6-year war finally, irrevocably, had an ending. Vittorio Marchetti did not live to see the spring. His illness, accelerated by weeks of stress and betrayal, claimed him quietly in his sleep on a cold morning in late autumn, 3 months after the council's judgment, with Dante and Elena at his bedside, and Matteo half asleep in his father's arms, holding his grandfather's hand until the very end. His final words, spoken to Dante the night before he died, would stay with his son for the rest of his life. "I built an empire out of fear," Vittorio had said, his voice weak but clear, his hand gripping Dante's with surprising strength. "I told myself it was necessary, that power required ruthlessness, that love and business could never occupy the same room without one destroying the other. I was wrong, Dante. Isabella taught me that lesson more thoroughly than I ever wanted to learn it." "Papa, don't let me finish." Vittorio's grip tightened. "You have a chance I never gave myself. A chance to build something for your son that isn't built entirely on fear. Eleanor loves you. Matteo will grow up knowing his father, knowing he is wanted, in a way I never gave you the chance to fully believe until it was almost too late. Don't waste that chance chasing the kind of power that cost me everything that actually mattered." "I won't," Dante had promised, his voice thick with grief. For a father he was losing, just as he'd finally, truly gotten him back. "I promise you, Papa." "Then I can rest," Vittorio had said, closing his eyes with something that looked, for the first time in months, like genuine peace. The throne is yours, Dante, not by default, not by the accident of blood alone, but because you are the only one who has proven again and again that you understand what actually matters. Build something better than I did. That is the only legacy I truly want. The funeral was attended by every family in the Tri-State Alliance, a testament to the respect Vittorio Marchetti had commanded across 30 years of careful, ruthless leadership. Dante stood at the head of the procession with Eleanor at his side and Matteo held tightly in his arms. And when the priest finished the final rites, every capo and consigliere in attendance turned to him, waiting, understanding, without needing to be told, that a new era for the Marchetti family had officially begun.
Don Marchetti, Renzo said quietly, the first to offer the title, bowing his head with the same reverence he had once shown Vittorio. Dante looked out over the assembled crowd, men and women who had watched him grow up, who had watched him fall, who had watched him rise again from the ashes of a betrayal that had cost him 6 years of his life, and felt the weight of the title settle onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a promise. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with quiet authority, "for standing with this family through everything that has happened these past months. My father built something extraordinary out of nothing, and I intend to honor that legacy. But I intend to build it differently than he did, with loyalty earned rather than fear enforced, with protection for the people who matter most rather than power for its own sake."
The crowd's response was measured, cautious. An underworld built on old codes doesn't shift its expectations overnight, but Dante caught in the faces of several younger capos something that looked like genuine hope, a recognition that perhaps the world they'd inherited might, under new leadership, become something less brutal than the one that had shaped them all. That evening, after the last of the mourners had departed, and the estate had settled into a quiet unlike any it had known in months, Dante found Elena on the terrace where he'd proposed, Matteo already asleep in his bed, the stars scattered thick and bright across a clear autumn sky. "How do you feel?" Elena asked, coming to stand beside him at the terrace railing. "Heavy," Dante admitted, "but not the way I expected.
My father's throne feels less like a weight now and more like," he searched for the word, "like a foundation. Something I can actually build on, instead of something I have to constantly defend from collapse." "You'll do it well," Eleanor said. "I've watched you these past months, Dante. You're not your father. You're not Isabella or Vincenzo. You're something new this family has never had before." "What's that?" "A man who understands that love and power don't have to destroy each other," Eleanor said softly. "You're proof of that, whether you realize it or not." Dante turned to face her fully, the weight of the day's grief and the day's transformation settling into something that felt, for the first time in 6 long years, like genuine hope for a future he could build with his own hands, on his own terms, with the woman he loved standing beside him, rather than hidden away from danger he couldn't control. "Marry me next month," he said. "Not a grand ceremony, not a political spectacle for the families, just us, Matteo, the people who actually matter."
Eleanor's smile in the moonlight was answer enough. Vincenzo Marchetti returned to the estate 6 weeks after his father's funeral, unannounced, his once immaculate appearance visibly worn by months of exile from the world that had shaped his entire identity. Dante found him waiting in the estate's foyer, flanked by 2 of the security detail who had recognized him but understood, correctly, that his presence required Dante's direct authorization before proceeding any further into the house. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Vincenzo said, before Dante could speak. "I came to ask for something I have no right to ask for."
"Then ask quickly," Dante said, his voice cool, guarded. 6 months had done nothing to fully heal the betrayal his half-brother's silence had cost him. "I want to see my mother," Vincenzo said, "one last time before whatever remains of her life plays out in exile. I know I have no right to request anything from this family, Dante, but she's still my mother, whatever she's done." Dante studied his half-brother's face for a long moment. The arrogance that had once defined every interaction between them, now replaced by something rawer, humbler. A man who had spent 6 months confronting exactly how thoroughly his own choices had cost him everything he'd once taken for granted. "The council's exile order applies to her, not to you," Dante said finally. "You're free to see her wherever she's currently residing. That's not a decision that requires my permission." "I know, but I wanted—" Vincenzo hesitated. "I wanted to ask your permission anyway, to show you that I understand now exactly how much damage silence can cause. I should have questioned what happened to you 6 years ago. I should have looked closer, asked harder questions, refused to simply accept a gift I knew somewhere wasn't rightfully mine. I didn't, because it was easier not to. That failure is mine, and I don't expect you to forgive it easily." "I don't," Dante said simply. "Not easily. Perhaps not ever completely." "I don't ask you to," Vincenzo said. "I only ask for the chance to prove, over time, that I'm not entirely the man who let that silence stand for 6 years. If you'll allow it." Dante was quiet for a long moment, weighing the request against 6 years of accumulated fury, against a father's dying wish to build something different than the empire of fear he'd inherited, against the simple, complicated fact that whatever else Vincenzo had done, he remained, still, the closest thing to a brother Dante had ever known. "There's a position," Dante said finally, "overseeing the family's legitimate shipping operations. Far from the throne, far from any position of real power over the family's future. It would take years, if ever, to rebuild trust to a point where more would be possible. But it's honest work, and it's a place to start, if you're willing to earn it properly this time." Vincenzo's eyes widened slightly, clearly having expected refusal rather than this cautious, conditional offer. "Why would you offer me anything at all, after everything?" "Because my father spent his final months teaching me that this family has been governed by fear and vengeance for far too long," Dante said. "I intend to build something different. That starts with breaking cycles, Vincenzo, not perpetuating them. But know this, if you betray this family's trust one more time in any way, there will be no second chance, not from me." "I understand," Vincenzo said quietly. And for the first time since Dante had known him, something in his half-brother's expression looked genuinely, uncomplicatedly grateful. He left an hour later to visit his mother's place of exile, and Dante watched him go with a complicated mixture of lingering anger and cautious, hard-won hope.
the first tentative step toward a peace this family had needed for far longer than the 6 years since Dante's arrest had first shattered it.
That evening, Elena found Dante in his father's old study, his study now, the space he'd slowly begun making his own in the weeks since Vittorio's death, reviewing family accounts with the careful, deliberate attention of a man determined to build something worthy of the legacy he'd been handed. "How did it go with Vincenzo?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Better than I expected," Dante admitted. "Worse than I might have hoped for in some ideal world where 6 years of betrayal simply disappear. But it's a start." "Your father would be proud," Elena said softly, "of all of it, the choices you're making." "I hope so." Dante set down his pen, studying her face across the desk with the same intensity that had first drawn her to him years ago, before the world had tried so thoroughly to tear them apart. "Where's Matteo?" "Asleep. Carmen is with him." Elena's smile turned playful. "Which means we have the evening entirely to ourselves, Don Marchetti." Dante rose from his desk, crossing the room to where she sat, and pulled her up into his arms with a possessive tenderness that had only deepened in the months since his release. 6 years of longing, finally, fully allowed to find its home. "I love you," he said quietly, his forehead resting against hers. "I loved you before prison stole 6 years from us. I loved you through every single day I spent in that cell, wondering if I'd ever see your face again. And I love you now, more completely than I ever thought myself capable of loving anyone." "I love you too," Elena murmured. "Enough to have waited 6 years without ever fully believing I'd stop." They stood together in the quiet study, the weight of everything they'd survived settling into something that finally, after so much darkness, felt like the foundation of an actual future. Not a fragile hope, stolen and hidden away, but something solid enough to build an entire life upon. The wedding took place on a bright, clear morning in early spring, in the same gardens where Isabella Marchetti had once orchestrated a betrayal that would cost this family 6 years of grief. A deliberate choice on Dante's part, a way of reclaiming a space that had witnessed so much darkness, and filling it instead with something that felt, finally, like light. Elena wore ivory rather than black for the first time in longer than she could remember, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, in a style that made her look, Dante thought, watching her walk toward him down the garden's flower-lined aisle, exactly like the young woman he'd fallen in love with a decade ago, before prison, before betrayal, before 6 years had tried and failed to fully extinguish what they'd built together. Matteo walked ahead of her, serious and proud in his role as ring-bearer, his dark curls neatly combed, his grey-green eyes, Dante's eyes unmistakably, scanning the small crowd of gathered guests with the particular solemnity of a 5-year-old who understood, on some fundamental level, that today mattered enormously, even if he couldn't fully articulate why. Renzo stood as Dante's best man, a position that would have gone to Vincenzo in another life, another timeline where 6 years of betrayal had never fractured this family so completely. Vincenzo himself stood among the guests, several months into his tentative reconciliation with Dante, his presence a quiet testament to the possibility of change, however slow and conditional it remained. "Do you, Dante Marchetti," the priest intoned, "take this woman to be your wife, to love and protect, in this life and whatever comes after?" I do, Dante said, his voice carrying clear and certain across the garden. 6 years of longing and loss compressed into 2 words that felt, finally, like the promise he'd been trying to make since he was 23 years old, and hopelessly, permanently, in love. And do you, Elena Rossi, take this man to be your husband? I do, Elena said, her voice thick with tears she made no effort to hide. 6 years of grief and hope and fear finally resolving into a single, unshakable certainty. When they kissed, the small crowd erupted into applause, and Matteo, forgetting his solemn duty entirely, threw his arms around both his parents' legs with the uncomplicated joy of a child finally, fully understanding that his family, the family he'd always deserved, the family that had been stolen from him before he was even born, had finally, completely come together. "Papa," Matteo said, looking up at Dante with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness. "Does this mean you're really my dad now? Forever?" Dante crouched down to his son's level, his heart so full he could barely speak past the emotion clogging his throat. "I've always been your dad," he said softly. "From the very first moment you existed, whether I knew it or not. But yes, Matteo, forever. I promise you that." Matteo threw his arms around his father's neck, and Dante held him close, breathing in the simple, uncomplicated scent of his son's hair, understanding in that moment exactly what his father had meant about building a legacy from something other than fear. 6 months later, the Marchetti family gathered for a very different kind of ceremony. Not a naming of successors, not a council of judgment, but a simple celebration marking the first anniversary of Dante's leadership, held in the same ballroom where he'd first reunited with Elena, first laid eyes on the son whose existence would ultimately reshape an entire empire. The families of the Tri-State Alliance had, over the intervening months, come to recognize something genuinely different in the Marchetti leadership under Dante. An emphasis on loyalty earned rather than fear enforced, on protection extended to allies rather than power hoarded jealously against all rivals. It was not, Dante understood clearly, a perfect transformation of a world built on violence and old codes. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, he had learned across 6 years of imprisonment and months of reconstruction, mattered more than perfection ever could. Isabella Marchetti lived out her exile in a small coastal town 3 states away, under the permanent watchful eye of the council's enforcement. Her once vast influence reduced to nothing more than memory and consequence. Vincenzo visited her occasionally, the fragile beginnings of his own redemption running parallel to hers, though whether either of them would ever fully reckon with the damage they'd caused remained, Dante knew, a question only time could answer. As for Dante himself, standing now at the edge of the same ballroom where his entire transformed life had truly begun, watching Eleanor laugh with old allies across the room, watching Matteo, nearly 6 now, growing taller and more confident by the month, chase Renzo's grandchildren across the marble floor with uncomplicated joy, he understood, finally and completely, that everything he had lost across 6 brutal years in a cell had been returned to him tenfold, in a form more precious than he'd ever imagined possible. Elena caught his eye across the crowded room and smiled, the same smile that had first captured his heart a decade ago, the same smile that had sustained him through 6 years of imprisonment.
The same smile that would, he understood now with absolute certainty, sustain him through whatever remained of the long, complicated, dangerous, and ultimately beautiful life they had built together against every possible odd the world had thrown in their path. He crossed the room to join her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of a decade of love finally, fully realized, and together they watched their son play beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed betrayal, watched him grow into a boy who would never once have to doubt, as his father had, exactly how deeply and unconditionally he was loved.
The empire Dante had inherited was still dangerous, still complicated, still built on foundations laid by men who understood violence as the only true language of power. But standing there, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to reclaim, Dante Marchetti understood that he had built something his father never managed in 30 years of ruthless leadership, a legacy rooted not in fear, but in love strong enough to survive betrayal, imprisonment, and 6 years of stolen time, emerging on the other side more resilient, more certain, and more complete than it had ever been before.